All right, we're going to talk about Chapter 5, Climate Change and Other Threats to Biodiversity. So, the causes of climate change that we see are caused by greenhouse gases. And these greenhouse gases are nitrogen oxide, carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. And as we'll talk about in a moment, a lot of these carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and methane have actually increased since industrialization. This video here kind of depicts how those greenhouse gases actually work. We have sunlight that reaches the Earth. It then is reflected off the Earth. Some of it's absorbed and re-radiated as heat from the Earth, but a lot of it is absorbed by those greenhouse gases. So as we get more greenhouse gases, then we then have an increase in the amount of heat that's trapped in the Earth. And so we know there's a human connection then to climate change because we can see carbon emissions in ice cores that can be harvested. This one from Antarctica, an Antarctic ice core that was gathered, and this showed that our CO2 concentration has fluctuated wildly over the hundreds of thousands of years. However, it typically stayed under 300. Now, in all of our lifetimes, it's been well over 300 and has recently increased to about 400. And of course, then with CO2, we see these temperature fluctuations as well. So these graphs show temperature and atmospheric carbon dioxide as well as with CO2 emissions. We can see atmospheric carbon dioxide going up with our CO2 emissions, and then temperature has increased as well with that. And so we can see then that really there is an easy to see human connection between climate change and CO2 emissions and the temperature of the Earth. So temperatures are changing differently on the Earth depending on where you're at. Areas with a lot of ocean seem to have less temperature changes, probably because the water is actually buffering and those temperatures quite a bit more than other areas. But the polar regions are changing at the greatest rate, especially up in the north. We are seeing wildly high temperature fluctuations and increasing temperature in boreal forests and elsewhere. And this is shown by a variety of different studies that in the Arctic, our percent change in temperature is going up. Polar ice caps are decreasing respectively. And then there's a variety of different impacts that are going to happen because of climate change. Increased temperatures, incidences of heat waves. 2016 was the hottest year worldwide. 2021, if you recall, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States had some of the hottest temperatures ever recorded, 115, 116 degrees. I happened to actually be down there visiting family at the time, and those temperatures are more seen in places like Arizona. We also have melting glaciers and polar ice, which is widely understood and seen in Alaska. Rising sea levels can then impact coastal ecosystems and as well as human activities. Earlier spring activity, when things thaw out, plants green up earlier. Birds then start to lay their nests earlier. This can lead to some mismatch between species that depend on each other. If one species starts to lay its nests, say the birds lay their nests earlier, but the insects that they depend on haven't also adjusted to the changing climate with their emergence, then those birds might have hatchlings too soon to be able to feed them. We're also seeing shift in species ranges. Species that are more suitable to the warmer climates. As that warmer climate expands in the north, they're moving to the north, and this can start to push out some species. Also, especially in mountainous areas where the climate's warming, these species are pushed further and further up the mountains to stay cooler, and there's only so far up in elevation they can go. And then, and likely, we're seeing species declines as a result of that too. Aquatic and coastal ecosystems are largely impacted by climate change because the warming temperatures can actually cause species to changes in their available food sources, as well as changes in symbiotic relationships. So the stress from the warm temperatures actually cause corals to expel their symbiotic algae. They're also impacted by the increasing CO2 concentrations, because those increasing CO2 concentrations decrease the pH, which increases the acidity of the ocean, and then that leads to coral bleaching and death of those corals, and that those make a really big habitat for a lot of different fishes, etc. Overharvest then is another major example of way where we impact species. These are tuna. Fish species are notoriously overharvested. We have some very well managed fisheries in the world. If they're able to be studied really well, we can often set good limits on what we do and how we harvest those. Now there are species, though, that are in the commercial trade, and some of it is black market, and some of it is legal trade. And these are some of the species of conservation concern in large groups: primates, birds, reptiles, ornamental fish, coral reefs, orchids, cacti, and trees that are in the trade. A lot of the species that are traded illegally, we don't have good numbers on how much is actually traded, because if there's a legal and an illegal version of the trade, say for orchids or trees, we have or even ornamental fish, we have farms that raise those species and then trade those species that are then individuals that are harvested from the wild illegally can then be laundered through those trades. And so therefore we have kind of an underestimate of how much is actually being traded and how much of that trade is illegal. Economies are directly tied to overexploitation, because in lower income developing countries, resources are considered common property, and we usually have traditional ways of regulating the use of those resources, whether it's harvest from specific areas and then moving to other areas so that you don't diminish the population too much, etc. When the wider world realizes that something has a high economic value, like orchids, investors and governments come in and start to allow or not begin to regulate, but let the harvest of these things occur. And that's obviously to improve the livelihoods of locals, as well as to increase the gross domestic product of these nations and basically make money. But it's oftentimes not done with good practices, and improving the livelihood of the individuals is basically trying to get yourself out of that hunting, gathering, subsistence agricultural lifestyle to be something that's more akin to what they see in developed countries. And as folks try to move towards that and gain that economic stability, sometimes these species of orchids and other things like this frog that's traded in Asian markets are impacted. Whales are another harvested species that is both illegally harvested, sometimes unsustainably harvested, and sometimes sustainably harvested for traditional purposes. And these are all the different whales that are harvested in the world. Now, many of them, and many of us know that in Alaska, traditional cultures harvest whales and do so sustainably, and it increases the value of these whales to to the public because of the traditional value that they have. Also increases the scientific information we can get from those, because typically scientists, biologists can only get the information that they can from whales that die on beaches and wash up. When some whales are harvested for these traditional uses, we're able to get biopsies, blood samples, etc., to understand the whales and their population better. Now, of course, there are plenty of illegal harvests and unfortunate uses. Japan's scientific purpose harvests were brought up in the book and have been a controversial thing that's been debated by the International Whaling Commission for many years, and seems to be starting to come a little bit under control, because as Japan had claimed they were doing for these harvests for scientific purposes, oftentimes it's thought that they're really ending up in the commercial trade. Invasive species are another big cause of loss of biodiversity in the world. And invasive species, when we define them, they're exotic species. They produce viable offspring in large numbers. They establish themselves in natural areas, and then they cause significant changes to the ecosystems that lead to some sort of harm. These are some plant examples. I'm an invasive plant specialist. These are European bird cherry on the left, a common water weed in the middle, which is Alaska's only aquatic invasive species, and then white sweet clover on the right. Some ways we get invasive species are as ornamentals. This is a rhododendron that's invading, I believe, northern Europe, and as we bring in these ornamentals that look pretty, sometimes they escape and spread out into areas and decrease biodiversity. In Alaska, our ornamental, one of our ornamental invasive species is the bird cherry, European bird cherry, Prunus patus. We planted it because it's hardy, produces cherries that attract birds, and generally is not damaged by moose. This is a picture of it. The white flowers in this picture are on Chester Creek in Anchorage, and that's the bird cherry. But what we didn't realize when it started to spread and started to take notice to is that other species of plants were in decline. It is then now known to be toxic to moose, which decreases the herbivore pressure on that and gives it an unfair advantage over a lot of the other trees and shrubs. It forms then monocultures and really doesn't support the insects, terrestrial insects that other trees support. And those insects that are terrestrial that fall into streams actually make up a big part of a young salmon's diet and trout, and can disrupt that food web. Colonization is an example. I put up here northern pike because when the U.S. began to settle in Alaska, it's widely believed that northern pike were introduced to South Central by folks that saw pike habitat that didn't have pike in it, and so they recognized pike as something that they liked to fish in where it was native, where they came from, likely upper Midwest United States areas, and so they brought them there and introduced them. And then, of course, pike, a voracious predator, became an invasive species. And so that's an example of how, when we colonize an area, we bring things with us to make us more comfortable in that area, things that we recognize, and in this case, something became invasive. We also have agricultural invasive species. Another example in Alaska is bird vetch. It was brought up to Alaska as a fodder or food for cattle, and also to build soils. It's a legume, so fixes nitrogen. This is bird vetch climbing up an aspen tree on the UAF campus, and that's how it actually causes issues. We abandoned using it for agricultural purposes because it didn't perform as well, and it's since spread in a variety of places throughout the state. When it climbs up these aspen, it actually reduces their growth, but then actually grows more itself, because as it gets up, it gets more light. It's able to invade forests then from these south-facing edges where it can get that light, and causes some tree decline. We also have accidental transports. Another example from Alaska is the Norway rat, which was introduced to Aleutian Islands via shipwreck. The Aleutian Islands are really important seabird nesting habitats because there's no predators there. When we have the rats then that move in, they start to prey on both the birds and their eggs, and saw seriously huge declines in bird populations and successful nesting rates. This is an example then of how islands and mainlands can have different effects by invasive species, which is the Cuba and versus Florida example. Island species often evolve without certain things like predators or certain diseases or other competition with different species. When we then introduce something that is used to that and has that advantage or is a predator, it can have serious impacts on those species. Whereas mainland species are usually less impacted because they've had so much more exposure to other species, other forms of predation and competition in their past. Diseases are another problem that we see for decreasing populations and biodiversity, and it's really in many ways coupled with habitat loss and fragmentation. As these habitats decrease, animals tend to have a greater contact with humans, our livestock and pets, and we as well as our livestock and pets carry diseases and then can transfer those to the wildlife, and vice versa as well. We also have, as we have smaller habitats, that tends to increase the contact that individuals within a species have with each other. And we know now with the pandemic and various other things, just the way disease spreads, that if we increase our contact within individuals in a population, we have increased transmission of diseases as well. And so some diseases that have been around for a while are now having a bigger impact than they used to have. An example of that is white nose syndrome in bats. This was actually, I believe, introduced to North America, but then is as roosting places become fewer and fewer and smaller, bats are transmitting this to each other in their winter roosting sites, and it causes them to die in the winter. We also have Lyme disease, which is spread from mice to and infects the ticks, gets into deer, can also impact humans, and as we get, especially with deer, have increasing populations of deer because of a lack of predators, but also they have shrinking habitats and sometimes really introduce themselves well to suburban and urban environments. We tend to also see increases in Lyme disease. So we have a variety of different impacts from diseases, invasive species, overexploitation, and climate change to biodiversity. And through conservation biology, we hope to decrease those impacts over time.